In the winter of 2010, in a quiet, well-off district of the Russian city of Irkutsk, people started dying. Not in one dramatic event, but one at a time, spread out over months, in a neighborhood known for being one of the safest in the entire city. Nobody connected the attacks at first. Nobody realized two young men, barely out of their teens, were behind almost all of them. And when police finally caught them, the reason it happened wasn't a tip from a witness, or forensic evidence, or a lucky break in the investigation. It was a family member going through a phone and finding something they were never supposed to see. The district was called Akademgorodok, Russian for academic town, a planned neighborhood built around a cluster of research institutes on the outskirts of Irkutsk. It had a reputation for being calm, orderly, almost sleepy, filled with academic families and students. It was the last place anyone expected a wave of violent attacks to begin. The two men responsible were Artyom Anufriev and Nikita Lytkin, both in their late teens at the time, and, by most outward appearances, unremarkable. They weren't part of any criminal network. They had no serious prior convictions. To neighbors and classmates, they looked like ordinary young men from ordinary families. Starting in December of 2010, that quiet district began experiencing a series of sudden, violent attacks on random residents, almost always at night, almost always without any clear motive connecting the victims to each other. There was no pattern of robbery driving it, no personal disputes, no connection between most of the people targeted. Investigators would later determine that many of the victims were selected essentially at random. People simply walking home, alone, at the wrong time. Over the following months, the attacks escalated. What began as isolated assaults eventually included multiple killings, among them a 12-year-old boy, and an attack on a pregnant woman who survived. In total, investigators would later attribute 6 murders and 9 additional attempted murders to the pair, along with several robberies. For months, local police struggled to connect the incidents into a single pattern. Attacks were happening in the same general area, but without an obvious signature tying them together, and without any surviving witnesses able to give investigators a clear description. The district, once known for its safety, became a place where residents were afraid to walk home after dark. The break in the case didn't come from a forensic lab or a police stakeout. It came from inside Lytkin's own family. A relative of Lytkin's, his uncle, happened to look through a memory card connected to his nephew's camera. What he found was disturbing enough that he didn't hesitate. He brought the footage directly to law enforcement. That single decision, made by someone with no investigative training at all, is what ultimately broke the case wide open. Once investigators had a concrete lead, the rest of the case moved quickly. Anufriev and Lytkin were identified, located, and arrested. During the subsequent investigation, prosecutors built a case connecting the pair not just to the murders, but to a string of additional attempted killings and robberies across the same several-month period. What made the case especially disturbing to the public wasn't only the number of victims, but the emotional distance investigators described in how the two young men allegedly discussed their crimes with each other, treating what had happened less like a series of isolated violent outbursts and more like a deliberate, ongoing pattern they were documenting and continuing on purpose. In April of 2013, the Irkutsk Regional Court delivered its verdict. Anufriev was sentenced to life in prison. Lytkin, who was 17 at the time some of the crimes were committed, received a 24-year sentence, later reduced slightly on appealed to 20 years, due to his age at the time of the offenses. For years, that seemed to be the end of the story. Two men, convicted, sentenced, sent to separate high-security prison colonies. But the case had one more disturbing turn left. In November of 2021, prison officials in Irkutsk reported that Lytkin had been found after a suicide attempt inside his prison dormitory. He was rushed to a hospital, but died from his injuries 2 days later. Nearly a decade after the crimes that made him infamous in the city where it all happened. What continues to unsettle people about this case isn't a mystery in the traditional sense. Unlike some of the other stories on this channel, there's no unanswered question about who did it, or whether justice was served. What lingers is something else. How close an entire investigation came to going nowhere in a neighborhood full of trained researchers, students, and professionals, until the case was cracked open, not by any of that expertise, but by one relative, scrolling through a memory card he was never meant to see. Sometimes the difference between a case going cold and a case getting solved isn't brilliant police work at all. It's one person in the wrong place at the wrong time, seeing something they can't unsee, and deciding to act on it. If you want to see more real documented cases like this one, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.